I'm Mayor Michelle Kafusi, and I am so honored to be actually back in my old stomping grounds of where I was raised, up here in Oak Hills with, I consider her a dear friend. She was a friend to my mother and our family, Francine Bennion. And so Francine, it's just an honor and a pleasure, and thank you for opening your home and letting us come in. We want to hear your story. We want to get it on record because, I mean, what you've done has been historical, and we need to be able to keep this in our records and share it with future generations. So can I just start by having you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about maybe where you were born and how you landed here?
I was born in Canada, straight north of here, about 60 miles over the border. So when I came to BYU in 1953, I discovered Rock Canyon. And in those days, it was not what it is now in way of use. It was not, I mean, now, as you know, if you go by almost any day, the parking lot is full.
So tell me, how did you get involved with this? Talk us through your Rock Canyon group and how you've got all of a sudden engaged with this desire to save Rock Canyon, and walk us through all that.
Well, it's a long story. A summary would be that it was absolute joy to work with so many human beings who cared profoundly about the same thing, and without power initially, worked together with diverse abilities, diverse experiences to do something that seemed impossible. To me, it's a wonderful story of what human beings can do together, which makes me so sad when they hate each other or compete only. But so I can tell you my part, but I hope to also indicate the number of other people that did so much. As you maybe you remember, although you were younger then, there was a proposal for a ski resort in the mountains east of Provo. There was going to be a funicular going up the mountain over the fragile, thin layer of dirt to Maple Flats, which is a level place on the mountain south of Y Mountain. And then from there, connecting roads through the upper drainage for Rock Canyon to Provo Peak. So the whole area in the mountains east of Provo would have been civilized. There were several problems with the proposals, and an environmental impact statement was done, and then another one was done. As I was walking down Rock Canyon alone one day, suddenly to mind came an article in the preceding day's Provo Herald, which said that the environmental impact statement was available to the public, to anybody that wanted it, in the Forest Service office. Now, why it struck me so intently as I was walking down the canyon, looking at the light and the vegetation, is something of a mystery, because I hadn't intended, when I'd read the notice, to do anything about it. Like so much you read in the paper, you just read it and tuck it away in your mind. But coming down the canyon that day, I thought, I'll go get a copy of that statement. It was a thick environmental impact statement, and it was full of flaws. And I don't mean just flaws of opinion, but flaws of data. For example, I may be remembering this wrong, and I should go back and look both at the original statement and the later. But I care about clean air. I care about people's health. I care not just because it's beautiful to see clear air, but because people are healthier, and because it feels better to walk in clean air. So when I read that I had worried about air quality in Provo with all of the increased traffic that would come to the base of the mountains through the town. Already the air is bad in the winter, as you will probably all know, but it would have been much worse with that enhanced traffic. Enhanced is the wrong word, enlarged traffic. So, do you know where they measured the air quality possibilities? They went down to the mouth of Spanish Fork Canyon, where the trees were all bent over from the powerful evening winds, and said that represented air movement in Provo. That's a bad error to say that the effects of the ski resort in Provo could be measured at the mouth of Spanish Fork Canyon.
It was a great catch on your part.
Yes. And there were other errors. For example, they were estimating in one of the early reports the snowpack in this area above the mountains. So they took the average of a 5-year snowpack as representing how much snow there would be for this wonderful economic development. Well, it's true that the average looked pretty good, but if you went year by year, like this year, the snowpack is small, and for a ski resort to survive was doubtful. But there were errors like that. And I was concerned as I read it. And so when the announcements came of the required public hearings on the environmental impact dangers, I went to the first meeting and stood up, and I think I went first to the forest supervisor, whose name I could tell you if I weren't trying. And I went to the mayor, but they both already had their minds made up. In fact, the mayor said at one point in a public meeting outdoors that they had this wonderful environmental impact statement, and I raised my hand and said, "Have you read it?" And he said, "Oh no, but I trust the people that did it." So there was that, and the forest supervisor, Nebeker was his name, was going to retire, and this would be a crowning achievement. So they had their minds made up. At the public hearing, again, I and others stood up and when it was allowed, and mentioned some of the errors. And here is this beautiful, irreplaceable jewel, for me as beautiful as the national parks I knew, although different. And it was going to be replaced with a faulty plan. And at the end of the meeting, it was clear that none of the evidence provided made a bit of difference. The decision was already made. One botanist had brought slides, several slides to show what plants would be destroyed by denuding the slopes for grooming for ski use, and also looking at the upper parts of the mountains and how this would change them. And in those days, there were Boy Scouts that hiked up in those high reaches. There was a narrow trail up to the Y, and then above that, over to the Squaw Peak Trail. It was all ignored. And then there was another public hearing in Orem, and again I went, and again said, you know, there's this data is flawed. This will change public access, because if the ski resort were built, Rock Canyon would become a service road. It would first of all be enlarged and flattened enough that diesel machinery could go up for the construction purposes, But then after that, for maintenance, also there was going to be a sewer line from all of the upper developments, especially on Maple Flats. There was going to be a big base resort with a big hotel. So none of this mattered. The decision was made. And after this second meeting, I sat there, and so did others that I didn't know, strangers. And so we gathered together, partly to grieve together. And I said, we have no power. We're a bunch of fringe tree huggers. We've got to figure out, if we're going to make any difference, how to have power. What can we do that will make any difference? And there was silence for a minute. And I said, we are voters. And if we get enough voters that running for mayor depends on our goodwill, because there'll be so many of us, we might be able to have an influence. But we first of all have got to make it clear that this is a community concern, not just a tree hugger concern. Mm-hmm. In those days, tree hugger was a popular insult for environmentalists. So how could we get enough voters that we would look like we were any influence on the power structure? So we decided, I decided, with the others' approval, that we would go door to door one night asking for donations to buy an article in the Provo Herald. Mm. Okay, so in one night we collected, I think it was $780 or something, just going door to door. And we'd get donations of $2 or $5. I went along $14.50. Yeah. I probably went to your
You probably came to our house.
But your mother may have been working.
She probably was working. You're exactly right.
But it was interesting to go door to door. We said we're trying to save Rock Canyon from being developed and turning into a service road, but we're also trying to save the watershed, mm-hmm. because our water in this neighborhood comes from Rock Canyon, and here we'd have poisons, chemical controls on water that drained into our sources, because the resort would go clear over to Provo Peak and include slopes on Provo Peak. And so our air was endangered, our water supply was endangered, the beauty, for want of better words, spiritual lift, and I don't mean religious lift, I mean the whole soul walking in Rock Canyon is moved in ways that for me don't happen elsewhere. But people door to door would give whatever cash they had. And I don't know if you remember Jordan Tanner.
Yes, very well.
Well, his was one house we went to, and he was running at the time for the state legislature.
I remember this.
And his wife said, maybe you should wait till after the election. And he said, no, I believe in this. I believe strongly in this cause. And he contributed, mm-hmm. and his name was there. And people all over Provo, there weren't a lot because we did it in one night. I can't remember why we were in such a hurry. But anyway, that was the beginning of the participation of a lot of people. And it was the beginning of our group working together in ways that I could never have predicted. For example, there were two professors. Although I taught part-time, they were full-time. There was a botanist, a biologist. There was a former businessman. There was a man whose position I didn't ever know exactly, but he was, this is 1989 at the latest, because we were, I think the first hearing was before that. Anyway, we had diverse abilities. So Jim Harris, the botanist, was concerned about biological diversity and the preservation of the native vegetation. He designed that. At one point we needed money for some reason, so he designed this T-shirt.
That's a great T-shirt.
And can you imagine a botanist doing that design?
Good for him.
And arranging for it to be printed, and then we sold it. Sold copies of it. They were all extra larges, so the production was cheaper.
Exactly.
But people bought them. BYU students bought them. Some of the Provo officials bought them. Everybody did what they could. We would get together for a meeting, and unlike Ginger's group, which is carefully organized and legalized, we were a bunch of diverse people who cared, getting together informally when we needed to. Mark Clemens, who was very good at many things, would provide maps and ownership identification of pieces up high, because there was private property up above the space between the mountains. So Mark had knowledge of record keeping, whether it was maps or whether it was property titles. And he did many other really important things. And Sam taught his students about the importance of the watershed. And anyway, everybody did what they could, and it was diverse. It isn't like we appointed somebody to a position or to do something. And some had contacts. For example, Mark was acquainted with the Nature Conservancy, was in fact finally left to work for the Nature Conservancy, but the Nature Conservancy was not interested in being involved in a local issue like this, which they thought was local. And I can't remember who it was. I think it was Mark that knew the Trust for Public Lands. Are you acquainted with that?
I am.
Well, for people who don't, a rich man established nationally a fund so that when people needed money to save public lands, they would provide it temporarily, and then people would raise money to replace it, so it would be an ongoing fund. I would not have known that that existed if we hadn't had this diverse group of people. Then there's Utah Open Lands, which does conservation easements. I'm glad you know all these things.
Yeah, they're all familiar.
But in our little group, I didn't know all of this. Other people didn't. Jordan Tanner knew there was a sportsman's organization that was influential with the State Division of Wildlife Resources. I wouldn't have known how to influence them, although I ended up finally going up and presenting to them, talking to them. Now I'm getting out of chronological order. We had to do many things that no one of us could have predicted. So in the course of eventually having conservation easements on spaces high in the Rock Canyon drainage, I had gone to several entities, including the Division of Wildlife Resources. And when I presented what we had done and needed to do in the way of state involvement with funding, I had talked with the Pleasant Grove supervisor of the Forest Service. But that reminds me again, Nebeker had retired and we had a new Forest Service supervisor, Pete Karp, who was just wonderful. Did you ever have anything to do with him?
I did not.
Oh, he was good. I knew that the change was coming, and I knew what date he would replace Nebaker, so I made an appointment with him and asked if he could hike with us up Rock Canyon the first afternoon of his day on the job.
So smart. That was a very strategic, smart move.
Well, it was good because we hiked up the canyon and talked about the project proposals. And I can't remember how, we weren't all available at the same time, which is another issue. If we had a weekday afternoon, people had to work. The BYU professors might be able to get somebody, have something else for their classes that day. But we couldn't all get together because Pete Karp was available on a Wednesday afternoon or whatever. We hiked up, and he was responding like you might hope any human being would. And another day, he got a Forest Service vehicle to take us on the Squaw Peak Road up above Slide Canyon between Y Mountain and Maple Flats. So we got out at the top by the road, and the vehicle driver went back to town, and we walked along the whole area that was going to be developed and down to Maple Flats. And I said, and this is where a major hotel is proposed, and this is where the sewer line will be. This is where the sewer line will go down to Rock Canyon. In other words, we went over the whole thing. So when we got to Maple Flats and crossed the small canyon, I said, and this is where the base will be, where the funicular will come up the mountain, and then there'll be a road where we have walked, which is a narrow path, and which will be suitable, wide enough and graded enough for vehicles, and as well as ski connections. And I said, this is where the main resort will be, and the sewage from here will end up down in Rock Canyon. And he said, over my dead body. And he was just great. He got his staff working together, and there had been one forest staff worker who had said, I don't understand why you're so excited, it's just another canyon. And that was the kind of Forest Service response we were getting. But with Pete Karp, there was this enthusiastic uniting to, does this matter? Why does it matter? How does it matter? What can we do? And it had been his staff, well, and it was the Forest Pleasant Grove district ranger that showed us which two pieces in the these developing pieces would be crucial and would be enough to prevent all the interconnection. So when I went up to the Division of Wildlife Resources meeting and presented to them and said we needed funding for two pieces, one of the Forest Service, one of the wildlife leaders said, why do you need only two? Is that enough? And I said, we only need two because that's the most economical way to prevent the development without spending more money than we need to do. And so they immediately approved it. And there were so many interchanges like that, that because we were diverse and because we had different connections and different skills, without ever being a tight organization, we usually succeeded. As you probably know, well, one of the pieces of research that one of us did was the history of the Seven Peaks group, and it turned out they had a series of bankruptcies. And then I suggested that if in the middle of developing these mountains they suddenly were bankrupt, as they usually became, they'd leave a mess. Mm-hmm. And Provo and Utah would have a very hard time repairing an unfinished disruption of the natural world. But again, that didn't make any difference to the powers at the time. But later on, it was very important in what happened. So that development died, and what we have left of it is mostly the water park that did remain. And we thought our work was finished. We had done a good job. We had conservation easements on key pieces. We had ownership by the state of key pieces. But then we had new mayors. And I can't remember at which point. I think it was when we were looking at the development of what now is the Trailhead Park. And the director of parks, whose name I've forgotten, was really good. And he wanted to apply for funds, for McAllister funds from the state, which is for the preservation of public lands, wild places, with several requirements. But the city would need to provide half the money. So we made an appointment with the current mayor, who was between Joe Jenkins, who had left to become economic developer for the state, and there were a couple of other shorter term replacements between him and George
Stewart.
Pardon?
George Stewart.
George Stewart, yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know all the mayors, so I can fill those in for you.
I'm sure you do. A hazard of my age is that when I reach for a name, it disappears, even if it had been there. So we needed money from the city if that were going to work. But I'm getting out of chronological order. Before we got to that point, it turned out that a developer, Carl Bacon, had bought the land at the mouth of the canyon and was proposing to build condominiums there. Then he changed his mind and decided he wanted to build single homes there. I think it was 13 or something. And that would not have worked actually to his benefit, because you get all this traffic going up to park at the mouth of the canyon, and that time they parked in little side roads or wherever there was a space. And now I suddenly lost what I was going to say. Oh, so there was a legal notice in the paper saying that he was going to appear in the city council meeting requesting that the zoning be changed so he could build the single homes. Well, we hadn't even known that he had bought the land. My husband used to keep his horses.
I remember horses at the mouth of the canyon up there.
There were some corrals. So here was the proposal, and if we were going to get state financial aid to do anything about it, we needed city money. And I can't remember which came first. First of all, I guess I went to the city council meeting where they were going to discuss the zone change. And I took my turn to go up and speak, and said that the proposal had been made to have the homes there, and that we hadn't known about the acquisition of the property, and that this was a big mistake, because if you go to the site, in fact, I even made an appointment with one of the council members beforehand, and went up there and said, you know, look at this, where the road turns up 1450, there's a natural beginning of the opening of the canyon, and it doesn't make sense to impede access to the canyon with a housing development there. And one of the council members, one more person making a great contribution, wisely said, well, have you talked to the developers? Well, that had never occurred to me. In the first place, what developer would listen? You know, they're out to make money. So I found out who, and the developer was at that meeting too, of course. So I asked if he would come to my house and we could talk. So we sat over there at the table, 2 or 3 from our group, and Carl Bacon and his wife Carolyn came, sat down. I guess they were in your ward maybe at the time.
Yeah.
Well, I mean after our time, after that time. So they came and sat down, and we talked about why we cared so much that public access to this canyon be prime, that it not be limited. With the ski resort, the public walking on that trail would have been dealing with diesel machinery and sewage upkeep, and now they would have to go through a neighborhood, and it was really important that the mouth of the canyon be part of the public access for whatever they wanted to do there, whether it was hiking or rock climbing or biking or whatever. And I really am proud, in retrospect, again, one more person who cared enough and listened enough. And Carl Bacon said, if you can get enough money to pay me what I paid for that property, you can have it, use it. Well, we didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we didn't have any money at all. And so I made an appointment with the interim mayor to meet in the conference room. But meanwhile, we had decided that whoever was elected mayor would be crucial to preservation of the canyon.
So it probably was Mike Hill, the interim mayor, was probably, and then he was prior to George Stewart, because then
no, it was George. What turned out, he was prior, yes, and he was the one that was meeting with us. But meanwhile, we had met with George Stewart and other candidates, chosen George as the most supportive, had lawn signs all over town, support George Stewart, and I think helped elect George Stewart. So at the time we wanted to meet with the mayor to get money from the city, and to get the city to participate in acquiring this land at the mouth of the canyon. We made an appointment to meet, which we did in the conference room of the mayor. And there were several from our group, there were 3 or 4 of us. And there was whoever you named, and George Stewart, who had just been elected. And so we sat down and we had said what the purpose of our meeting would be. And the current successor to Joe Jenkins said, there's really no use in our talking. There's no money. We cannot provide any money for acquisition of this land. George Stewart quietly said, I think we can find the money. One more good man making a good decision, and he took the money from the general fund of the city and bought that land, which is now the Trailhead Park. And then the parks man got money from the McAllister Fund, asked me to write a letter supporting it. But I have left out one more thread. You know, we kept thinking our work was done. And this is before Ginger. Although Ginger was, I don't know if you know, she has health problems, but she was walking up to the fountain, the first fountain, every day, and was very much caring about the mouth of the canyon. But between the earlier problems and the mouth of the canyon acquisition, there was the Richard Davis problem. Richard Davis is a man that lived up Provo Canyon, and he had a diverse background, but he, in partnership with another man, had purchased the opening cliffs of the canyon on both sides of the trail. And then the other, his partner, sold his share to, I think it was about 3 men, one of whom was John Valentine, a state senator, and who was very good. Again, another, there's so many that did their piece, whatever it was in our group or with those we worked with. So one day I was walking in the canyon early in the morning. I used to go at 6 a.m. and come home and get my children up for school. And there was machinery up there, and they were blasting the rocks. They were blasting the cliffs, and you can still see the debris. And not knowing anything about this beforehand, I came home and phoned up. It was Billings by then that was mayor, Lewis Billings. And I phoned him up at his home phone, didn't know him, but I poured out this problem that the cliffs were being blasted as we spoke, and that if something wasn't done immediately, these magnificent cliffs would be destroyed, and there would be trucks hauling rocks, who wanted to sell them for landscape rocks, through the residential part of the city. So it was bad because it destroyed the cliffs. It was bad because it changed the mouth of the canyon. It was bad because the roads would be suffering from heavy loads of rocks going past people's houses. It would add again to the air problems. So I started pouring this out to Lewis Billings, and he interrupted me and said, "You don't have to scold me." And I didn't think I was scolding him. I thought I was pointing out that there was an immediate problem, and that it couldn't wait for thinking it over or discussing it over. The blasting of the cliffs was in operation. Anyway, that had happened before we got to the meeting about acquiring the land from Carl and Carolyn Bacon. And George Stewart did, well, in the first place, there was a long period of time about the cliff blasting, and Richard Davis, the man up the street, lawyer, was working for the city on that for a long time. And that got resolved. And it turned out that the Richard Davis didn't have a mining permit, which was one way to stop him immediately. And then there were legal problems, and then Ginger also got involved there. There were all kinds of problems about the ownership, and therefore how could you stop what was being done by one owner when the other owners didn't agree to it. John Valentine didn't want it. So we just kept having one thing after another, after another, after another, and never with any intent of being a permanent organized group or a formally organized group. But we continued to have that initial few of us who cared enough and were committed enough that whenever there was any danger to the canyon, we would come together. And there were others who joined us. Tim Whipple he had actually proposed to his wife in Rock Canyon and cared about it. Paul Cox, who's a world ethnologist, was involved when he was in town. Jordan Tanner stayed caring about it as a state legislator. So, although I've suggested a few stages, you had this loosely aligned group that would be larger or smaller, that would respond when there was a threat, with no concern about who was the power or who was in charge. We all did what we could, and everybody in that group contributed in various ways, but part of it was by contacting so many people that were significant. So when I look at the canyon now, which is a city park with no need to cut the lawns or put in a sprinkling system, they did build the restrooms and then the amphitheater. But to me, that canyon continues to be a magnificent, world-class, magnificent natural gem. But it's also an expression of human beings who care enough to do whatever they can, to do things they've never done before. I'm sorry to be leaving out a lot and going on longer than I intended.
That is such a great story. It's just, it's amazing, and it's cherished by the citizens of Provo, and our goal is to get this down on record so that for generations to come, they'll know the history of a group of engaged citizens that took on a task and finished one task and another task, and they just kept coming at you. And so thank you for sharing. Is there anything else you think you might have left out that you would like to share?
Oh, there's so many people that I've left out, and I wish I could name them all. But I really appreciate you.
Oh, thanks,
and
Francine.
I appreciate your caring about the natural world. I think it's important, of course, for a mayor to care about so many different things, but not everyone cares about the natural world outside their own specific dominion, and I appreciate you very much.
Thank you. It's my therapy. It's for selfish reasons that I'm up in the canyon every morning in the dark and on the shoreline, and it's the way I am able to pull myself together to go back to work every day. And it is just really, I loved your point where you said that to me it's a sacred place, but the spiritual piece in the spirit, it fills your spirit with goodness.
It does.
And it always has for me, even as a young girl up there exploring. It's a safe place, and it's beautiful, and it needs to be protected and watched after by wonderful people like you, and hopefully like me, that I will be able to keep using you as a mentor and stay on task with that Rock Canyon and keep it as beautiful as it is for generations to come. So thank you, Francine.
Thank you, Michelle.